And this is one of the things that we run into all the time in the engagement I talked about, the cannabis authority, that what the wholesalers needed, what the retailers needed, and what the consumers themselves were interested in, different pieces of data. So managing this created a huge challenge for them, an enormous problem. So all of that has to be managed across multiple different channels, and in future, those channels will be even greater. So one of the biggest questions I get from people, they talk about, for example, being able to populate the title in Amazon. They talk about being able to get the right data for search engines like Google or Google Shopping. So they're very interested in how can they, first of all, stage that data, enrich it, but then when they distribute it, how can they be sure that they're going to come to the top of the search? And there's a way to do that. There's a whole science and an art around doing that. But the next question I get is, what happens when people do voice search? Do they search in a different way? How should I organize my content so that when Alexa is doing all this for us, the experience understands both the way in which they're doing that, so that could be the venue, also understands the content, so the content renders correctly. And let's face it, the way that the content should render on my mobile device could be different for mobile devices, could be very different from the way the content might render if I'm just online in my PC. So we have to understand that. We have to understand also the occasion. And that's the point I made about the path to purchase. Now, having said that, what we have to do is to understand what's happening around the content itself, so its completeness, but also what's happening around the execution of that. So what do we see in terms of the completeness? Lots more different sources for this data, and the job really of managing the transformation so that it works effectively for each of the different consumption points, and so that it understands also is tagged so that it will be triggered by the right point on the path to purchase. So some very challenging data management, and I would say data insight challenges there. What else? Each SKU or stock keeping unit, each item, and its attributes expanding enormously. I already talked a little bit about, one of the reasons that it's expanding, because what they're trying to do is to attract people's attention. But the other thing that's interesting about this is that increasingly there's more regulatory, let's say, rules around this. So in particular, work I've been doing with people, say, in France, they think they're really different there. They think that the regulations around food and the content that you have to publish is different there. It's not really. It's the same everywhere. There's a lot of very strict rules about it. You better get it right. And so the stuff that they're putting on the packaging had better be the stuff that's on the website as well. But increasingly, some of that attribute expansion is being driven by customers' attitude. So the customers themselves care about the item. Was it responsibly sourced? What kind of impact did it have on the environment, or perhaps on the people who farmed it or built it? And I just talked about the fact that voice content is becoming important, but increasingly, I would say augmented reality is important, not so much virtual reality. I've seen some cases of that, a PIM and virtual reality, particularly in the case of automotive. So there are some well-known examples. I'm sure you know the BMW and Accenture example there. That still, I think, is quite a long way from becoming mainstream. But the augmented reality, absolutely. Why? Because people are taking their mobile devices with them into the store. And you may remember the whole idea of the moment of truth that Procter & Gamble pioneered, this idea of being able to, how do you reach someone in the aisle? We call these now mobile moments. So people have their mobile device. How do you reach out to them? How do you persuade them to select your item rather than something else? It's going to be content. Yes, it might be a promotion, but actually that's very widely overused. We call it promiscuous promotions. But we recently did some custom surveys. We recruited 1,200 respondents, a panel of 1,200 people across the world, and we asked them, how often do you get promotions when you would have happily paid full price? And we found 51% of people had had in the last 4 weeks a promotion when they would have happily paid full price. So what really should have persuaded them to buy would have been not a reduction in price. And that's what the retailers are always doing, but it should have been some content, something compelling for them, for their values, and for their situation when they were in the aisle. So all those things are driving more PIM adoption. What else are we seeing around the quality of this data? Increasingly, people beginning to use some artificial intelligence and some machine learning around improving the quality and also measuring the quality. So you'll know this, and this is stuff that I've been working on a lot, that really good product data feeds will give you some feedback immediately. So immediately you upload a new image, it will do some A/B testing, and it will tell you, does this image generate traffic? Does it generate click-through? So all that kind of thing is becoming more and more easy to do with the cloud. The thing that's also interesting to me is that the images themselves are increasingly being tagged. And the tagging is using this to drive more data insights about what matters to people and which types of people and which point they are in their path to purchase. So some technology is really, really helping around this. What do we see then around targeting? So I talked about the idea of targeting people, and personalization, I would say, is still really pretty much at segmentation. There's some level to which we can get beyond segmentation. The question is, how real-time can we do that? Now, the models that do this typically are using, at the moment, mostly using the very large processing power that we have in the cloud to do that segmentation and to understand where a person is in their path to purchase and to trigger the right content for them. The question is, what's the round trip time to their mobile device? And so one of the things that we've seen, particularly around artificial intelligence, is that they're moving this kind of recognition more and more to the edge of their network. So some of you might have seen at the beginning of the year, there were some really good examples of, for example, recognizing people's expressions. I had never believed that this could ever really work. And so one of the vendors who was demonstrating, it was part of Intel's lab, they pulled me in front of the camera, and it recognized, first of all, skepticism, followed by amusement. Now, I said to them afterwards, I bet that you programmed that on purpose. I can't really believe that it recognized it. So they then brought somebody else. But it's interesting and amazing to me what you can do with cameras now. And there are cameras everywhere watching us all the time, even when we're on our own PC. So that enables us to get more triggers. So these triggers, the trigger, if you like, for my skepticism was to then show me the word skepticism, and that then triggered my behavior of showing amusement. So imagine if we could do this with lots of other content to recognize where people were, and maybe not using that very obvious cue of what was my facial expression, but using other stuff like what baskets that I abandoned. This is a really interesting thing. You know, people are always online and they're always looking at something, putting it in the basket, then abandoning it. Actually, that's a trigger. That says they needed something else to help them. Maybe some other content, some other description. Maybe we need to ask them. Maybe we need to have some kind of interaction with them. But the point is, that's really changing the way that we do this kind of targeting. So yes, the endpoint automates the targeting. What about operational excellence? So we thought about content. It's all very well. You can have great content, but if you can't really make it operational, if you can't get it in front of people, it doesn't really help. So what are we beginning to see? More and more of this stuff moving to the cloud. No surprise to you, I'm sure, there. But that delivers much better, I would say, connectivity. So we talked about this idea of an abandoned basket, but maybe it's not just the abandoned basket. Maybe it's other stuff. Maybe it's complaints that I made. Maybe it's goods that I had bought and returned. Maybe it's questions that I had asked. So how would it be if I could combine, let's say, that clickstream data with other data that the enterprise knows about me? And that's really where the cloud helps in this. If we're able to mine that data sufficiently well And if we're able to correlate it with the content that we have staged and purified and enriched in PIM, if we're able to correlate it, and if we're able to deliver it to the endpoint in time to influence what they're doing. What else? This is the area where I specialize in around syndication. So if we've got all this stuff, how do we get it to the endpoint? How do we get it to marketplaces in particular? So we have data around marketplaces that shows that more and more of online commerce will be through marketplaces. So every brand, and in fact every retailer, needs to learn how to live with Amazon rather than to compete with them, and not just Amazon, but other marketplaces as well. So all that kind of thing has to be thought about. The point here about the legacy networks is that those legacy networks are typically oriented around what used to be the data pools, and oriented around, I would say, structured data, which, do we still have to exchange structured data? Absolutely. Does it still matter? Yeah, it matters to people. What's the size of something? What's the weight of it? Will it fit in my car? Will I be able to get it into my house? Will it work with all the other entertainment equipment I have? Will it be compatible with my fridge? All that stuff matters, but it's not enough. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient to delivering the compelling experience that you need as a brand or as a retailer. So what else are we seeing? Lots more around the governance. So tons of stuff around having different data models. So today, I know you'll be looking a lot at data. The whole point about PIM is to be able to have very flexible and multiple data models. So a little bit like my cannabis legislation organization, they realized that actually over time they couldn't have a kind of fixed data model that says this is what always describes an item. They had to be able to flex that and to change it. Yes, for different channels, but they're going to have to change it over time as people's behavior changes. And this is really why, when we look back, say 10 years ago, the whole idea of having a kind of standard like the Global Data Synchronization Network sounded wonderful, but it was never going to be able to keep up with the change in the market that we've seen since e-commerce. So all of that important, and I talked a little bit about the fact that food and beverage, and the fact that I'd say there's more and more, I would say, statutory regulation of what data that you have to have. So something important there to be able to manage your data too. Okay, so we talked a little bit there about product information and why it matters. Let's just talk for a minute about the difference between product information and master data management. Well, typically it's really different types of people who are interacting with this data, and it means the data has to be managed in a different way, and it fundamentally has a different data model and often a very different, I would say, IT architecture. So I work with quite a lot of companies that say we can do both of these equally well. Actually, normally it's quite hard to do that because there's a very different, let's say, IT model that underlies all of this. So what do you have in the MDM world? It's typically, let's say, IT users. It's people who are coming out of an ERP type world. There is, yes, a very rigid governance model around it. And a thing is not ambiguous. It either is or isn't correct. So what is it really? It's a master record. And it's normally where we see the central distribution point for, I would say, data that is more supply chain oriented. So if we look back at the old GS1 and the data pools, they were really good at doing this. They were absolutely terrible at doing what PIM does. So they didn't manage lots of different contesting views of data. They certainly didn't manage any kind of dynamic governance model. Anyone know how long it is since the last GS1 data model was approved? They normally approved about every 3 years. Why is that? Because everybody has to agree on it. And that just is never going to work in a world where you're trying to keep up with the consumer whose tastes and whose interests are changing all the time. So you have a dynamic governance model for PIM, and it's really all about, I would say, enrichment of product content. It's about that media that really drives the engagement, snags the customer, and gets them to engage with you. So point I made, when you upload some content, when you use a data feed, it immediately does an A/B test. It immediately tells you, is that driving traffic? Is it driving click-through? And that you never get with MDM. It's not the right kind of thing at all. So now I just want to do the first of our little surveys. I'm going to give you a minute. We're going to have 2 surveys. I'm going to give you a minute to go to this website and to answer these questions. What do you think is really going to drive more, let's say, need for PIM? Is it going to be channel expansion? We talked about multiple channels. Is it going to be attribute expansion? Are we going to have the pointedness of the lettuce, the pepperiness of the lettuce? Or is it SKU expansion? Is it more items? So while you do that, I'm going to... So there's where you have to go. I'm just going to log in and see what you've said. Launch it here. Okay, so now you should see it. Yeah, no, it just went down. Yeah. Okay, interesting. So, how do I make this visible to everyone now? Oh, I know I do this, don't I? No, that's not it. There. This is working fine. There we go. Oh yeah, show them the results, yeah. Okay, so there you can see that of the people in the room, actually SKU expansion is the least important as far as you can see from the PIM perspective. But the channel expansion, look at that, and the attribute as well. So interesting that that's what you thought. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. We can get there. Yeah. Sorry about that. There we go. Perfect, thank you. Awesome, thanks. Okay, thanks. So when we think about PIM, we're also thinking about the convergence of these different tools. So remember I talked about the fact that let's say, standardized data is also important. So things like weight and cube also matter to people, and they're part of the engagement. They're not going to attract them so easily as, let's say, great image or great, let's say, copy that you've written. But they're still important. And this is really where we need to manage all these elements, the digital assets, the product information, and the transformation in making this really work through the life cycle of the product, but more important, I would say, through the path to purchase. All of that comes to make content management. So what's helping us in doing this is increasingly, yes, I talked about integration, but this is the point, the data. Remember we talked about the kind of data about what baskets I've abandoned, what all this kind of stuff, what might trigger different engagement with that customer at what point. And really what we have to do is to automate our understanding of the data and to use that to drive the new engagement. So yes, there's some tools which are coming to help us with this. So some cloud-based machine learning is helping with this, helping us to understand what people are doing. Helping us also to translate and to be able to reformat the data. So some of this is becoming more and more automated and helping us to do our job. But there are some other things to think about. So we've been doing some work around headless content. And I think all of you will know and will understand that in the past people bought e-commerce, and e-commerce had a kind of lowest common denominator. Some content, but not a lot. Some order management, some personalization. That basically doesn't work anymore. We've already seen, if you know IBM WebSphere, nobody's using the WebSphere order management. They're using the one that they bought from Sterling. IBM actually sold off the whole of WebSphere to HCL. Why? Because now it's all about combining different data. So they sold it to a systems integrator because the systems integrator can find data from different sources, can personalize, can find content from a PIN and can present it in real time or real time to the person's path to purchase. And we're seeing this happen all the time. We've seen it with Oracle Commerce, we've seen it with ATG, and we'll see it with other people as well. Now, this was rather a heartless thing that we said about hotels.com. But the reason I'm putting it up there is all of you will have had this experience that when you book a flight or maybe a rental car, you'll also be prompted to book a hotel. Now, I did some research on this and found out that most people want to do that on a mobile device. But they also want to see something about the hotel. What will persuade them to actually book that hotel is if they can see a specific room and book it. Who knew? I mean, that just astounded me. That doesn't resonate with me at all, but the research shows that's what they want to do. And it means that this content that's provided has no idea what the end point is going to be. So particularly in travel has led the way here, but it's going to expand from travel into consumer goods and then into capital goods as well. So we'll see it in B2B markets. You do not know what the end point will be. It might be mobile today, but who knows? In a couple of years' time, it might be voice, and who knows what it's going to be after that. So the point is that the content itself has to be able to be orchestrated into any endpoint. Is this making sense, what I'm saying? Is it I'm a bit of an IT nerd, I'm sorry about that. So, but the point is, all that's great content, but what we have to do is to figure out how, when we create that content, do we make it absolutely neutral as to the way in which it's going to be consumed. And then in terms of the consumption, how do we mine the data that we have about the item, about the person or the type of person, and about the place where they are. So it could be the time of day, it could be the place. You could imagine if they're within a certain number of kilometers of the hotel, that might make a difference to what you show them as well. So all that stuff has to be managed in this, what we call this headless way. And that's really what's driven consultancies to try and get involved in this. So consultancies who have, let's say, the ability to have some data science and understand something about data have typically been trying to come into this market. So you'll see they've been looking at how could they get involved in this world. But then when we look at what people are really doing here, when we look at the service agencies, for example, and external agencies, what's really involved, we find there's actually quite a different mixture of what people do in-house and what they do externally. And what I want to do in the next bit is to look at what can we do to make sure that perhaps we capture more of that and not the consultancies and maybe not some of the very big agencies as well. So if we look here, one of the things that I wanted to really draw your attention to is this 45%. So notice in the in-house there, notice that what people are doing is increasingly, so this 45% are looking to their in-house IT resources to manage, because they believe the in-house IT resources are better at orchestrating that enterprise knowledge that I talked about the customer and the customer's path to purchase. So what are we looking at? We're looking at how could we capture that 45% instead of it going in-house. Does it make sense? So that 45% is the number I want you to remember and to think about how might we capture it. So increasingly, when we look at what some agencies are doing, they're beginning to build their own, let's say, technology stack around the client's own technology stack so that they can fit in where there are gaps. Now, where are there gaps? There's typically gaps. The CMO typically actually needs something more than just what they get from the CIO. And we'll look in a minute and see what they specifically told us they are lacking and what they really want to get. So yes, I think we all know this. We know that all agencies are under siege. This is something we know. But what's particularly interesting is to understand how these internal and external organizations can work together. And just the thing that I wanted to talk about is that when we look at how people are managing this, they're typically putting together a team that has both some, I'd say, traditional digital marketing or digital content capability, but usually has some kind of data science or some kind of analytic capability as well. And I'm going to show you what it is that the CMOs tell us they're lacking and what they really want from agencies to help them with this. So the marketing leaders say they lack these skills, and you can see what they're thinking about, the technology skills specifically around customer insights. When we decompose that, and we'll see some more on the next slide, yes, of course, they're looking for content. They're looking for digital experts to help them with that. But the number one, look at the top there. When they talk about technology, it's about being able to make the content relevant to each customer at the point they are on their path to purchase. So that's really about being able to mine that data and to be able to relate the data about the item, so the content that's in PIM, to the particular point on the path to purchase, to the particular values that each customer or perhaps customer segment has. So given that that's the case, we ask them then, well, very specifically, what do you not have? And you can see here, they're talking about a lack of knowledge managers, a lack of information architects. Now, can they get that all internally? Can they get it as well as they could from an external expert? I think probably not, and that's why we've seen those consulting companies coming into this area. But it's a terrific opportunity for agencies, and particularly digital agencies, to think, how could we acquire some of these? So interestingly, I noticed down the bottom here, they think they've got plenty of project managers. They think they've got enough business analysts. They think they've got enough content management people. Maybe. But as I say, sometimes when people answer these questions, they answer what they wish was the answer. But for us, what we want to look at is the big ones up there. So we look at this about business architects, what they're lacking. But for me, the biggest thing is that they lack information architects. They lack people who are able really to help them relate the content they have to the situation of their prospects and customers as they're going through their work. So a couple of years ago, last year, we did this segmentation of different types of agencies. So forgive me that they're agencies around content. But what we wanted to do was to understand what kind of capabilities they were acquiring to help them move up that value curve. So remember that 45%? So what were they acquiring in order to help them get there? So notice some of the skills that they were talking about there. So they're talking about, yes, of course, about content, but increasingly about data and about data science and about mining it in order to generate the insight to trigger the right data at the right point. And then we took some I have much more of this, and incidentally, you'll get all of these slides. You'll also get a list of the reports that I used. So if you'd like any of the reports or any of the data, you can just email me and I'll share it. I just produced some of the mid-size agencies that we mapped onto this type of capability, and some of their clients and the type of, let's say, clients that they had. In this case, I'm just showing you the mid-sized agencies, but we have one for large agencies, global ones. We have one for small and local ones. But what I wanted to show you is the extent to which some of these agencies are acquiring these capabilities in order to reclassify themselves in a different segmentation and to grab some of that 45%. Is it making sense? Seeing a few blank faces. Okay. So now I'm going to be very daring and go on and do another poll. I'm going to ask you which of those technology capabilities are going to be most important for you. So I'm going to launch that now. No, it was already off. So it's hashtag B608. Sorry about that. It's the Wi-Fi. Okay. So now I think you can see the questions. And what I'd like you to do here, you can answer, actually you can choose the top 3 that you think you really want. So don't choose all of them, just choose the top 3. And then as it completes, ooh, look at that. Okay. How do I show them? No, because I want to show it from here, don't I? Don't I show it from here?
All just disappeared.
Where is the definition? We have to show it. Because I don't know how to do the presentation.
No.
Can you please?
Up there?
Yeah.
Sorry, can you help me show the results of the poll, this one? Is it this one? Or?
The second one, go to the
Yeah.
And then we want to present it on.
Oh, there it is. Perfect, thank you. Thank you, Amadeus. So talking of technical skills, perhaps we need to brush up on this online polling. But look what's interesting here. When we ask you about the top 3 skills that you're really looking to get, it's the integration of CRM to automate the personalization. So you're well onto this. You know what you need to acquire. And then notice also the AI-driven decisioning for the content. So you know what you need to get. And I think that would be probably, from our perspective, would be similar to what we see other companies doing as well. Interesting, this stuff like R and Python, so Java, yes, for the user interface, but R and Python, particularly, I would say, sought after skills for people to be able to mine that data from various different sources. I mean, one of the things that I should say about this that's different is that that data comes from many different sources. You can't look at a single resource, and you can't also have very, I'd say, traditional IT skills. You need the skills that help you to understand and make a quality decision based on data from different places. So let's then go back to the slides. Perfect, thank you. Move. Oh, I'm sorry, I got it upside down.
Second question around, I think.
Yeah. Sorry about that, sorry. That's it. Okay. Okay, so I think then if the goal is to grab this 45% that we looked at, and if the goal is also to meet the CMO's perceived lack of technical skills, can you do it more effectively than their in-house people? Almost certainly, because their in-house people are focused on that structured data. So typically, and I work with a lot of CIOs on this type of thing, they have their hands full with master data management. It's a different thing from what you're doing. It's a different thing from PIM. And their skill set is all around structured data and around, I would say, the whole world of obeying rules and obeying structure. And that, as we saw with the whole world of GDSN and GS1, it can't move fast enough to do what we need to do now. So to increase your scale of the marketing budget, you have to keep going with what you're planning to do. So to acquire those skills that trigger the content based on what you know about not just the item, but about the customers and about their specific circumstance or context. So I'd like to say thank you very much for listening to this. Sorry about the problems with the polling. And these are the reports that I used. You'll get a copy of this. You're very welcome to take any of those reports, and here are my contact details. Thanks so much for listening. Thank you.
PIMCore. Own the digital world.